Hello and welcome to the Adventist Risk webinar, 4 steps to reopening churches. My name is Chris LeBrun and I am the Manager of Marketing and Communication for Adventist Risk Management here in Silver Spring, Maryland. And we are just so thankful that you are with us today. We're happy to have you. With me is David Fournier. He is our Vice President and Chief Client Care Officer, also based in the Maryland office here in the United States. And we are just grateful to have you with us. David, welcome.
Thank you.
And just a couple of housekeeping tips for you this morning. I'm sure many of us have had a lot of experience over the last few weeks with Zoom. And so you are probably very familiar with that. But if you have not been on a webinar before, I do want to go over, there is a question and answer button on the bottom of your Zoom app, and that will enable you to answer questions or to ask questions. We will be the ones that are answering those for you during this webinar, and go ahead and use that feature throughout the webinar, and we will get those questions answered. We're also recording this webinar. I want you to be aware of that, and it will be available on our website, adventistrisk.org. And following this, the conclusion of this, so you can always check back to that at any point in time. We've also shared a similar webinar that we did for our North American clients on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Adventist Risk. And so you can visit that if you would like to see that as well. But I think with that, David, we are going to turn the time over to you. I will come back at the end with some of the questions that may have popped up, if there are any. And again, we just thank you for being here so much.
All right. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate working with Chris and all of the expertise that he brings to make sure that events like this are possible. And also want to say a thank you to Karina Franca, who's working behind the scenes, helping to answer questions and make sure that this all runs smoothly. Thank you for joining us today and making safety and risk management a priority in your ministry. We appreciate partnering with you. I always love hearing the stories of people who are actually engaged in risk management on the ground in their local church or school, whatever your ministry may be. You are our true partners out there. I hope that you will find this webinar to be an encouraging webinar. I believe that it is strongly rooted in the gospel to care about people's well-being. And that is where we're coming from, and what we're trying to address today is how do we care for people's well-being in this context of the COVID-19 pandemic situation. So I hope that you can join me in the spirit, in that spirit, as we look at this situation and practical steps that we can take as we look at reopening. How do we reopen effectively, safely, without causing further challenges, and to do it in the most reasonable and prudent manner possible. So let's back up just a little bit and make sure that we all have a baseline understanding of what the COVID-19 pandemic is. So I'm going to share just a few points so that we have that same baseline of COVID-19. It is a virus, came from a certain province in China back in December of 2019, and it is new for people to have this particular virus. How it spreads is very important for us to understand, because a lot of what we're going to talk about throughout the webinar, and yes, I will advance the screen when we start into the webinar proper. But it's important for us to understand how COVID-19 spreads in order to take the right steps to prevent its spread, especially as we reopen and have people gathering together in some capacity. So what we've learned is that COVID-19 spreads between people who are in close contact with one another, within 2 meters of one another. It spreads through respiratory droplets produced when an infected person coughs, sneezes, speaks. I might add to that, sings. Anything that will project droplets from one's mouth or nose. These droplets can land in the mouth or noses of people who are nearby or possibly be inhaled into the lungs, thus spreading the virus. Some people without symptoms may actually be able to spread the virus as well. So you may have the virus and not have any symptoms of the virus. So it's important for us to take a fairly proactive approach for a number of reasons. Number one is the health and safety of those people who are our members, our visitors, those we're seeking to reach in our community. We want them to fellowship with us and learn about the gospel, learn about the good news in safety and without fear. So, symptoms of COVID-19. It's going to be important for us to understand what the symptoms are as well, because if somebody is symptomatic, if they are exhibiting symptoms, it would be better for them to remain in their own home and not associate with a group of people as much as possible. So you're going to be asking people who are exhibiting symptoms to stay home, even if your church is at a state where it can reopen. Symptoms can include cough, shortness of breath or difficulty breathing, fever, chills, muscle pain, sore throat, new loss of taste or smell, and in more severe cases, pneumonia. So some of those are symptoms that we see taking place for a regular flu or a cold as well, but they are characteristics of this particular virus, the COVID-19 virus. So let's get into the webinar itself. Our main guidance are that we're going to follow across the board is an understanding that local laws or guidelines about this may be different in different locations. Whether you're in, this country or that country, this province or state or that one, the laws of guidance about how to respond to COVID-19 and reopening a church meeting may be very different. And we're asking you to follow the laws in your area. That is a good guidance, and it's a good way for your church to be a good citizen. It also aligns you with the accepted practice and reasonable expectation in that area. We'll talk about liability, I'm sure, before we're done, but that would be one of the ways that you can exhibit a reasonable behavior. I would add to that the idea that our church organization has a church structure, and your guidance from your local conference, union, or division may be more specific than even the government. I would definitely follow the government laws, and if your church organization laws are more specific, follow those as well. You are part of that organization. They are asking you to follow those laws. Please do so. Or guidelines, I guess is a better term. So what we have to understand as we look throughout this webinar is that local governments and or organizations that you respond to may be lifting restrictions, may be easing their restrictions at different times and with different steps. And there's no way for this webinar to cover every aspect of that. That is not the primary goal of this webinar. But just because we are having this webinar is not permission to move forward. You need to take that those indications from government and your church organization as well. Okay. It was very interesting to me as we moved into this pandemic several months ago. I remember there was some cases, some of the first cases of COVID-19 in the United States took place out on the West Coast. And I remember hearing about the state providing guidelines at that time that no more than 500 people could gather in one place. And I thought, wow, that's remarkable. And then quickly another state said, well, only 150. And then it was pretty much everyone went down to 10 very, very quickly, as they realized sort of how this virus worked. They were able to make the guidelines more effective. I think what we need to understand is that we may need to look at that guidance in reverse and look for that guidance in reverse as well. So as various jurisdictions begin to ease restrictions and allow churches to resume meeting, they may do so in a limited capacity at first, with maybe limiting the number of attendees, and as well as other guidelines. They may have guidelines in place still about how to keep distance, whether it's maintaining that 2 meters of distance, or other guidelines. Are masks still required? I use the term mask, face covering. I realize that most of these are not technical masks in that sense. So are they still requiring those face coverings? Are you only allowed to gather as groups of 10, or is that number allowed to be more than that? Watch for that guidance and realize that this is a fairly unprecedented situation around the world. To my knowledge, certainly in my lifetime, we've not had this type of pandemic that has caused the stay-at-home laws and guidance that this one has caused us to experience. So that said, it is just new, and there will continue to be new changes to the guidance from your government, your local authority, from your church organization as this develops and as we learn more and more about this virus. So we're going to look at 4 steps to reopening today. Step 1 is to clean, and we're going to talk about that in some detail. Step 2 is to mitigate risks. Step 3 is communication. That will be critical. And step 4, of course, is to reassess procedures often. And I kind of just highlighted that idea that just because there is a plan doesn't mean that the plan doesn't need to be reassessed when it isn't working correctly. If there is new information, better information, or different guidance, it's important to be able to respond to that as a reasonable person or organization would. So let's get right into it. This first step is cleaning. And of course, when it comes to cleaning, we're looking at having a cleaning plan. And it really needs to include 3 specific time periods. There should be a cleaning prior to opening, prior to reopening. There should be cleaning during the week and while services are going on. Yes, I said while services are going on. So prior to reopening, what are you trying to achieve with cleaning in that phase? For many of our organizations, those facilities, your church facilities, may not have been used for some time. They may have been empty and just not used. So it would be important to do a good clean of that facility. It's not always clear how many and who has been in the facility. Maybe somebody has been, I hope, someone has been in there checking to make sure that all is well with the facility, making sure that the property is cared for. So it is important to do a deep clean before allowing a group to come in. I think that should include not just a regular sanitization, a disinfection of surfaces, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but we should think about some of our building's systems. Think about your heating and cooling systems. If you have those, you may want to ensure that all of those systems have been aired out and had a chance to have filters replaced, and you may want to hire a professional to come in and conduct that activity to make sure that your systems that move air are really clean. In fact, you may want to refrain from using those systems while people are present, just to ensure that you're not moving and spreading the virus by moving that air. The guidance that I've heard repeatedly is, as much as possible, while people are meeting, have open windows. Fresh air from outside seems to be able to mitigate the concentration of any potential virus that might be there. During the week, oh, one more thing about the before opening cleaning, and that would be in regards to water systems. Water systems also may have been stagnant. You may have had water just sitting in pipes. If you have water fountains, they may have been just sitting in those fountains. This is a real opportunity for various types of bacteria, molds, various problems like that could cause other types of illness. So this is aside from COVID-19 entirely. There could be any number of challenges with that as well. So again, does your system need to be flushed effectively? Do you have ice built up in a refrigerator or a freezing unit of some sort? So have that either replaced, have your water flushed. Make sure, you may want to make sure that you even test to see if there's any bacteria or molds that have developed a residence in your systems, and make sure that those have been cleaned out effectively before allowing people to make use of those facilities. While services are going on, and we'll talk about that in perhaps a bit more detail on the next slide, but what we're concerned about here is obviously we want a clean facility for people to enter and participate in, but you also have other things to think about. If everyone's using that front door and holding those door handles, door knobs, you may want to have those cleaned, disinfected on an ongoing basis as people come and go. I would suggest that a good remedy to that would be to have your doors propped open so that people can come and go without touching those doorways. You are going to want to think about, what about your bathroom? I hope that you will see the sense of having a smaller group meeting at the beginning of a reopening phase. Whether you make that group smaller by choice, by asking some folks to continue to participate online, or one of those solutions, or you break the service into multiple services so that people can worship at different times throughout the day and just keep a smaller group. That becomes important as you consider that at some point someone may need to use a restroom facility, a bathroom facility, and those should be cleaned. The guidance that we've seen has indicated it would be good to see that cleaned pretty much between each person's use, because there's often contact that takes place in that scenario. So ensuring that those are kept clean is very important. Let's get into some of the parts of the church that we need to think about throughout the cleaning process. Again, we're thinking about pews and furniture that's located on the rostrum, all of the seating for the congregation, the chairs, the podium, all of those pieces of furniture that people may be interacting with should be cleaned with a disinfectant ahead of time. I'm not going to go into details in this webinar about different types of disinfectant, other than to say that there is great information about that. Using something that is over 70% alcohol is often recommended. There are different types of disinfectant that you can use. So I encourage you to make sure that you have and can use that. I know that there's even information out there on how you can put that together yourself. We talked about bathrooms, but other considerations would be mother's rooms, the lobby, and any other common high-touch areas. We'll talk about Sabbath schools in just a moment. Back into the sanctuary, though, I think about AV equipment, audio-visual equipment. Do you have microphones? Will people be touching those microphones, those stands, any of that stuff? Are people going to be sharing those devices, those electronics? So something to think about, and ensure that those are cleaned as well. As we get into a point of guidance on the AV equipment is, if at all possible, it would be better if people were not sharing those things, the microphones. If somebody can have a microphone that only they use for the entire day and have it cleaned before and after, that would be a much better scenario than having people share those things. In the Sabbath school areas, we need to think about Sabbath school in the reopening phase. And I'm sure we will get back to Sabbath school as we know it and love it. But I think particularly of some of the guidance I've seen for especially those Sabbath school for young people, the cradle roll, the kindergarten, the very young Sabbath school classes, really needs to evaluate whether it is practical in an initial reopening phase, whether they reopen at that time at all. Because you have young people who usually need quite a bit of supervision, and the guidance is to keep them 2 meters apart. Some of the guidance I've seen, particularly for daycares, child care centers, and schools, has been to keep them 2 meters apart, all facing in the same direction, if they're using desks in a school scenario. And I think that kind of guidance from for schools and daycare centers is really the most appropriate guidance for reopening for our Sabbath schools for kids. So is it practical to be conducting Sabbath school in that sense? Think about all of the teaching aids that you use, whether it's toys that we use to sing songs. Those need to have been cleaned ahead of time, which is easier to do with, a smooth surface thing that is made out of wood or metal or plastic. It might be much more difficult to clean some items that are, plush, fabric based. And then the idea that you are handling and distributing, recollecting, perhaps sharing taking place becomes problematic. I don't think that is really in keeping with what we're trying to do. We're trying to keep people at a distance and not share things between us. We talk about even the chairs, the tables, and all of the furniture in the Sabbath school rooms would need to be cleaned. So we've talked about air conditioning units and filters already, having those systems cleaned, preferably professionally and flushed beforehand. One more note on both Sabbath school rooms and the sanctuaries area is, in the initial reopen phase, we encourage you to actually remove all hymnals, Bibles, anything that people can touch and share. Where I use this, and perhaps in the next service somebody else uses the same thing, or next week. If those could just simply be removed for the reopening phase, that would be better, so as to not have that transfer take place. For Sabbath schools, I think it really begs the question, and I'm not telling you whether you should or shouldn't, but I think you should very strongly consider not reopening Sabbath schools in your initial reopen phase. Maybe that can wait a few more weeks, where it's more practical. Maybe the restrictions are eased even further. Something to think about. Step 2, mitigation and critical review. Examine your church program to find things that have added risk, are an added risk scenario. I would look at items like social gatherings. We are a social community, and that is one of our strong points. Potlucks. I'm not sure that that terminology is the same absolutely everywhere, but it's the idea that we gather together for a meal. We also think of communion in that sense, and I've seen some incredibly creative things taking place in our church to be able to engage in social gatherings, as well as communion services, even online. And if your church hasn't experienced that, I can assure you there are some very creative ideas out there on how you can engage in those solemn services or social gatherings creatively, even when you're worshiping from home. So I think we need to refrain from those for a little while longer, even as we move to reopening, because those are opportunities for people to be gathered together in a way that may limit their ability to stay socially distant, that 2-meter rule, as well as, you bring to a potluck or a meal, you're going to bring some food to that meal. It's going to be shared. People are going to be using the same serving tools. They're going to be getting into lines. They're going to be sitting at tables together. So they're going to be very close. The idea of social distance and having no contact is really almost impossible, I think, in those scenarios. So I think we can avoid those a little while longer. What about choir and praise team practice sessions or engaging in those? I think, a choir, how would you have your choir be each individual 2 meters apart? I'm not sure that that is practical. So perhaps that's something that can wait a little longer. But that said, I have seen praise teams, that are working and functional, and they are staying, 2 meters apart. And but just keep in mind the need for cleaning, distance, and any other protective measures that you can take for those types of scenarios. These are just a few ideas that you should think about. We talked about hymnals and Bibles in the pews. Just remove those. There are other ways to solve the same problems. We can have our music perhaps projected on a screen. There are apps with our music in them as well as Bibles. So people may be able to use their electronic devices, or perhaps bring their own from home and then take those back home with them. That's been one of the fun things about worshiping at home, is that we've connected with some of our digital solutions and our own solutions more effectively. Passing of the offering plate. Here's an interesting challenge that we experience. Perhaps in your area you have an online giving option. I hope that you do. If not, there are other creative solutions. Obviously, we would really hesitate to pass an offering plate as we traditionally do. But one suggestion I read from the Trans-European Division, they had some guidance documents that they provided, and I liked this idea a lot. It was, rather than passing an offering plate, have a central deposit, one container that people can drop their tithes and offerings into, either as they're coming in or exiting the facility. I would suggest that should be guarded by a burly deacon to ensure that the offering goes in and doesn't also leave. But I think it's a practical solution to solve this problem. Teaching aids in Sabbath school classes. Again, we've talked about that already a little bit, but they really difficult to keep them clean and keep those classes engaging in the way that they have been without using all of those tools and toys, whether we're talking about noise making devices that the kids enjoy for singing and praising, or felts or plush toys that get handed around. All of the fun things we love to do in Sabbath school seem to involve touch and being close together. So things to think through in your scenario. New policies to consider as well. Before the service, require face coverings for everyone in attendance. Taking temperatures at the door. This was new to me, but there are incredible devices that allow you to take a temperature without contact. So having volunteers at the doorway that can take people's temperatures and ensure that they're not entering the facility with at least a high temperature, a fever symptom. Installing automatic doors, and I realize many churches may not be able to install automatic doors just whenever they feel like it. That may be an expensive thing to pursue, but for those that can, it is a good solution for making sure people are not all having to touch those door handles. There may be other automatic type of appliances that you may consider as well. In bathrooms in airports, for example, we often find the water faucets operate without contact. We're able to just move our hands under the faucet and it pours the water. Also for soap and an air dryer. So we would look for those kinds of solutions when practical for your organization. You may not find that to be something you can do at this stage, but if you can, something to think about. During the service, of course, we're going to discourage handshakes, hugs, and other member contact during the service. We're trying to keep that distance from each other during the service. It will be really hard to do. I think when people get together and they're in the same place again, it will be exciting to see each other, and we will want to have that contact again. But I think it's important to, and we'll get to the communication phase next, but we'll want to communicate that we are looking to discourage that kind of contact interaction. We talked about this idea already, the idea of, in order to do some of the measures that we've been talking about, such as keeping distance from each other in the pews or in the church in general, it would be easier to do if we had fewer people in attendance at one time. So it may be effective to conduct 2 church services with a break in between for cleaning, so that one group isn't sharing whatever they're carrying with the next one. Keeping groups smaller makes it more manageable. Block off sections inside the sanctuary for social distancing. So the idea here is that perhaps your church has done this for communion. In my church, when it comes for the week that we do communion, we will actually have every other pew blocked off for the communion service. And this allows the deacons to move through those empty pews with the crackers and the wine. So my terminology has just escaped me there. But at any rate, we could use the same approach that we've used in communion for social distancing at this time. Perhaps we block off every other pew and mark out what the distance would be so that people can have a sense as they're moving into those pews that they can use that, okay, well, this is me sitting 6 feet or 2 meters away from the next person or the next family. After the service, dismiss the audience 1 row at a time. Again, this is something that is done in many churches already. Certainly that was the case in the churches I grew up in. It doesn't seem to be the way things work in the churches that I go to now. But it is just another way to control the flow of people, make sure that they're not all coming to a bottleneck at the entrance of the church as they're exiting, and allows for that smooth distance based approach. Let me also add at this point that I think it's important for us to think about our ministers. It is a long-standing tradition for many ministers as they conclude the service and leave, walk out, they often stand at the doorway and greet the congregation after the service. And that's a very nice practice. I look forward to getting back to that. However, I think at this point, even with reopening, we would probably do best to avoid that practice for the time being, because that one individual is now coming in contact, very close proximity with every single person in the congregation. And so I think we need to think about that ahead of time and just plan that when the minister is finished, that they're going to not stay at the back of the church. And the rest of the congregation should be encouraged to do the same. When the service is over, we're going to move right out of the door into our vehicles or however we're going home. And we may need to continue to supplement our service with Sabbath schools that take place online, or opportunities for socialization that take place online in addition to meeting in person for the actual service. I think it would be good for us to supplement what's taking place, at least in the reopening phase. Let's talk about communication, because I think this is absolutely critical for any sense of success through the reopening process. All of these changes we've talked about may be challenging, may be confusing, may be difficult for people to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. In my experience with this scenario so far, there is a very wide range of thought on this pandemic, on COVID-19. There is about as far a range of thought on it as is possible, I believe. So, each one of those people, no matter what they think about it, are a child of God, and we love them, and we want to be able to worship as brothers and sisters together. But it is important to communicate what the expectations are before you return into your reopened church facility. So you'll want to prepare your members, and you can do this in a number of ways. Hopefully through the stay-at-home phase, you've been able to put together a more effective email list, maybe communicate via email. Perhaps you can hold a Zoom meeting to do some Q&A and discuss what measures are being taken at your church facility. And you can use social media to let potential visitors know as well. We're going to talk about some of the more practical items on site here in just a moment. You're going to want to make sure that people understand what the expectations are when they return to the church service at your church facility. You're going to ask members who have any of those symptoms, like a fever or sneezing and coughing, to stay home, even during the return or reopen phase. We've kind of hinted at some of these ideas already, creating signs and floor stickers that can remind members about the various expectations, to use a face covering, to avoid contact with other individuals, physical contact, to maintain that 2-meter distance. Reminders, as well as, and the idea of floor stickers is to help people kind of see what that looks like. I don't know what it's like at your local grocery store, but at mine, I've had the opportunity to go there several times during this whole scenario, and there is guidance, just signs of what the expectations are, and stickers on the floor that kind of show, what every 2 meters looks like, so that we just have a sense of, oh, I'm getting too close to that person, or, okay, that's 2 meters, I can get a little closer. We might use bulletin announcements and on-screen messages I am particularly attracted to the idea of the on-screen messages. And obviously, we can use the announcement segment in church to again communicate this is what we're doing, this is how we're doing it. At the close of church, we're all going to walk out and away from each other and to go home. I'm not as excited about the idea of using printed paper bulletins. I'm not saying that you can't use them, but obviously there's the more potential for contact by distributing those, and then there are more items that would need to be cleaned up afterwards. But it's for you to think through that practice as to what meets the needs of your membership most effectively. I realize that in many church families, some members are not using email, they don't have that, or maybe due to vision challenges, they may need other types of help. So you can work through some of those details in the context of your local governing authority guidelines and your church organization guidelines. Practices, especially of the pastor, should align with the messaging. I hope there are a number of ministers on the call today. And I thank you for your leadership as well in this whole process. It has been encouraging to hear from our ministers' leadership, to see them lead by example throughout. And I think at this time it will be particularly important. It will be important for you to show that the rules apply to you as well as to anyone else. This is the concept of leading by example. For any risk management topic, one of the most significant factors for risk management to be successful in any type of organization is an idea called tone at the top. And you are the top leader in that church congregation. So your example, showing that you care for people's well-being and that these measures and steps that people are taking are something that you're taking very seriously, is a clue. It is a signal that they should take it seriously as well. Likewise, if you don't take it seriously, most people will not take it seriously at all. So you have a real opportunity to lead, and I ask that you do so. Step 4, reassess procedures. Discuss with your safety committee how things are going. As you reopen, they are a good group to work with on setting up your reopening strategy and steps and all of the planning around that. But they are also going to be very important for reassessing, to figure out what is working, what is failing, what are we not doing as well as we need to do. If you don't know what I'm talking about right now, what is a safety committee? I encourage you to read more about that on our website, adventistrisk.org. That is an idea that we've been promoting for many years at Adventist Risk Management. It is the idea that one individual, a safety officer, should be elected to spearhead efforts for safety in your congregation, and a safety committee can work with that person to make sure it is implemented across ministries. We have a whole job description, webinars, all kinds of information about how to set that up in your congregation. We encourage you to make use of those. You're going to need to revise as needed and communicate to members. It's what we've talked about throughout this webinar, the idea that this is a new scenario, and the whole pandemic has been interesting because we've seen guidance even from governing authorities sometimes shift or change, and what we thought we knew is turned out to be a bit different. So this is that type of scenario, and you may need to adjust course as well, and everyone needs to understand that this is a developing process. As we've talked about already, follow the guidance from your state and county health departments, even as those continue to develop. as far as possible, monitor the health of your members. I hope that is something that you care about doing on an ongoing basis anyway, but certainly in this time, it would be good to be able to know if someone is suffering from this virus. It may also become very important for the idea of contact tracing. If someone was in attendance at your service and they became ill, who did they have contact with? Might be an important thing. You may be asked by people who are trying to find out what all the contact points were, who they may have come in contact with, and you may need to be able to provide that information. And this is sort of the hard part of risk management, is sometimes you have to say, this isn't working, let's take a step back in order to take a better step forward in the future. Sometimes the best laid plan doesn't work and it needs to be reassessed. So be prepared to take a step back if needed. In summary, and there's so much more we could talk about, but the idea of serving our membership, of protecting our members and visitors, is absolutely consistent with the concepts of ministry. It's about caring about people's well-being. And I hope that you will lead and partner with us in that process, in that way. We're asking you to follow the guidelines that are contextualized for your local area, whatever country, state, or province you're located in. I've seen a lot of great guidance from, I've been looking at guidance in the UK, the NIH, the ECDC, the European Center for Prevention and Disease Control. And I'm sure we could get much more granular than that. There's guidance in many jurisdictions. For example, where I'm located, I am in the United States right now, and where I live is in the state of Maryland, and the state of Maryland has very strong guidance about what we can and cannot do at this time. But we have started to move towards an easing of restrictions, and as we've done that, they've actually allowed the counties, which is lower than the state, to make more specific guidance. I happen to live in a county with large incidence of COVID-19, and so we're at a much more restricted level than a few counties over, where the restrictions are very, very much eased. So that said, I think it's just important to follow as that progresses and work in harmony with those governing authorities. And we'll probably talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A. As we wrap up, and I'll ask for Chris to come back on and help us go through the Q&A, I also wanted to say thank you to our team based in the St. Albans office, Graham Barham, Melissa Edwards, Sandra Aguilar, who have been providing leadership and support for you from that office as well, and helped to get the word out about this webinar. And I'm sure are answering lots of questions already before we ever got to this. So I really appreciate working with that team and visiting with you whenever possible. And I appreciate your support from each of the divisions across Europe and Africa as well. So I appreciate that very, very much. Chris, I see you're back. Are you ready for some Q&A? Do we have any questions we can work on today?
Yeah, I think one of the questions that has come up as we have discussed this topic is the liability that churches may have surrounding COVID-19 when we come back and start having services in a physical building again. Does that open us up for any liability around the area of negligence? And what does ARM cover in those instances? How can we protect ourselves from any of those potential lawsuits?
Okay, that's a good question, and I'm going to answer it. But let me just say that there are answers to many of these questions, including this one, on our website at adventistrisk.org/COVID-19. So when it comes to liability, so let's look at a scenario where that might happen. Somebody attends your church and they at some point afterwards discover that they have COVID-19. They are going to need to be able to provide a reasonable indication or proof that they contracted COVID-19 because they attended your church. I think that's going to be fairly difficult to do, but I'm not saying that it's impossible, especially as contact tracing becomes more and more effective. But let's just say it is probably a difficult thing to prove that they got COVID-19 at your church, because maybe they got it on the way to church. Maybe they got it earlier in the day somewhere else. Did they not get it at the grocery store, at the gas station, at the petrol pump? Any number of other places that they could have come in contact with it. And how do they know for sure it was absolutely at your church service? Difficult to prove. But that said, this would fall under bodily injury. So that's a general liability insurance response to that kind of a scenario. They are a third party, wow, that is alleging that your organization has been negligent in some way, which caused them to have bodily injury. So I will add to this conversation the fact that there is very, very little case history to reference on this. What that means is we don't know how these scenarios are going to actually play out in a court yet. So it makes it really new territory, uncharted ground. That also means that the language in the insurance policy is untested largely. It may need to be further refined in the future, but for right now, there's nothing excluding protection for your organization because someone accuses you of causing them COVID-19. So to my understanding is we would be able to help mount a defense. How this all plays out ultimately, difficult to say at this stage. Very difficult to say. But we are confident to say that at least we expect that in that kind of a scenario, we should be able to mount a defense.
What about other types of services in our sanctuaries, funerals, weddings, baptisms? How should we proceed with holding those functions?
I think cautiously, for sure. I know that in many places funerals have been obviously permitted even during some of the more extreme stay-at-home scenarios. But again, would look to try to implement as many safety measures as you possibly can, even for those. And if there is an opportunity to reschedule as things continue to ease, that might be the better choice to make. Obviously, that may not be the case with a funeral in particular. But again, is it possible to give the facility a deep clean, to provide some distancing features, to keep the doors open, to encourage everyone to wear a face covering? These are all measures that we can take in each of these kinds of services. Some of them, we'll need to rethink a little bit. How do we do this during COVID-19? My heart has gone out to several whose weddings have been either canceled or completely changed during this scenario. For many, they wanted to keep the date of when they were scheduled to be married, but for many, the place they were going to get married has canceled because they're not allowed to to have those events take place. So I've heard of many weddings taking place at home, in very private, small ceremonies. So challenging, and we probably haven't thought through all of the logistics of a wedding for the purposes of this webinar, but definitely I think we can use the principles that we've talked about and apply those and start to think through some of the specific logistics as well.
I think the other question that has come in that's a good one and maybe a little bit challenging is for those congregations that rent a facility from another church. You've given us some great guidance if we own our facility and ways that we can keep our congregation safe. How do we approach that if we are renting a church from another congregation and may not have control over the air conditioning units and the heating units and things like that? How do we approach that?
Well, again, I think we've learned the principles that we can apply to this, and I think you're going to need to work with that congregation. So in this scenario that I think I understood you describe, we're the ones renting from someone else, and we would obviously need to work with them in a positive Christian spirit to say, how do we navigate through this together, because we don't want to cause you to transmit an infection to you, or it's probably the wrong terminology, but transmit the virus to your congregation, and likewise we don't want it from you to ours. Something interesting to work through. I hope that you have some sort of contractor use agreement that may help provide some clarity moving forward. Hopefully both of those organizations are able to navigate that within the guidelines of the local governing authority. And I would encourage you to be proactive on the cleaning side. If both parties overdo it, then you're probably going to be okay. That's sort of the spirit that I've seen is, can we clean the facility for ourselves before and after ourselves? And if the other party wants to look at it from the standpoint of they're also going to do that, great. That makes both parties feel a lot better about it.
And again, it's a great opportunity for communication between the two congregations and just opening up those lines of conversation and communication. Well, we have been sharing some resources in the chat, and those are all available on our website. David gave the website there, the URL, adventistrisk.org/COVID-19. And we are making all of those available on that website. Of course, we have some other resources here, World Health Organization and the European CDC. So we encourage you to continue to look at this and continue to do research. As David mentioned, this is a ongoing situation that we continue to get new information in on as new research is conducted. And so probably one of the advices that I know David would give you probably is to continue that research on your own, and we will do that as well and continue to make that information available on our website, adventistrisk.org/COVID-19. Just a reminder that we will make this video available on our website just as soon as we can get it up there. That will be there probably later on today. Here in the US, maybe tomorrow for those of you in the European and African time zones. You may find that tomorrow. But again, thank you for joining us. David, do you have any last words for us as we wrap this up?
No, I just really appreciate the leadership of the various divisions and pastors, lay members who are taking these steps to ensure the safety of their congregations. I love the attitude that is in harmony with Christ, who while he was here on this world occupied himself so much with caring for people's well-being. And I think that as disciples of Christ, we would do well to follow that example closely. So I thank each of you. I thank the team in St. Albans, as well as each of you wherever you're joining us from around the world. We are praying for you. We're in this together, and God has a plan and a purpose for us, no matter what we see taking place in the world around us. I would encourage you to look at what we may have learned during this stay-at-home process at this time. We've seen churches taking place online like never before, small groups meeting in new and interesting ways, new solutions for online giving and all kinds of things. Whenever we see a massive disruption like this, we see incredible creativity take place. Let's not lose that as we move into the reopening phase. What if we've learned valuable things that we should keep doing going forward? Maybe we've found ways to disrupt our organization into better success and doing more effectively. We have a mission, we have a purpose, and it is important that we be about our Father's business. So that's my encouragement to you is, let's not look at this as a time of discouragement, even though there are some incredibly painful things happening in the world. Let's look at this as a time of encouragement to be able to do things in new and interesting ways, perhaps more effectively than in the past. So I want us to take an opportunistic approach, and that's probably the wrong word, but I want us to move forward. And that's my appeal to you today.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And with that, we will conclude this webinar. Thank you again so much for joining us and for prioritizing the safety of your congregations and your churches. We just appreciate your partnership in that area. And again, thank you to our team in St. Albans. Again, we appreciate you. Have a great rest of the day and stay safe. Thanks so much. God bless.